The day had started like any other for Nicholas Harper. The sun filtered through the blinds of his modest office, casting long shadows across stacks of papers and files that seemed to multiply overnight. Nicholas sat at his desk, tie slightly, loosened, sleeves rolled up, and a cup of lukewarm coffee sitting forgotten beside him. His focus was on yet another corporate case, dry, tedious, and far removed from anything meaningful. It wasn't the kind of work that made him feel alive anymore. It was just work. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual chaos. Car horns honked, footsteps echoed on the pavement, and snippets of conversation floated in through the open window. Nicholas barely noticed. He'd been practicing law for over 2 decades, but somewhere along the way, the fire he once felt had dimmed. These days, he went through the motions, helping clients who could afford his services but rarely needed his passion. Just as he reached for his pen to sign off on another document, a faint sound caught his attention. At first it was easy to dismiss, a distant cry muffled by the hum of traffic. But then it grew louder, sharper, cutting through the monotony of his afternoon. It was unmistakable now. Someone was crying. Not just crying, but sobbing, the kind of raw, desperate weeping that comes from deep pain or fear. Nicholas frowned and leaned back in his chair. Was it coming from the street? Maybe a child hurt themselves outside. He glanced toward the door, hesitating. Then, without warning, the sound became deafening. The wooden door to his office flew open with a loud bang, startling him so much that his pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. Standing in the doorway was a boy, no older than 8. His small frame shook violently as tears streamed down his dirt-streaked face. His clothes were rumpled, his sneakers scuffed, and there were scrapes on his knees as if he'd fallen while running. For a moment, all Nicholas could do was stare, taken aback by the sheer intensity of emotion radiating from this tiny figure. The boy didn't wait to be invited in. He stumbled forward, his wide eyes locking onto Nicholas's with an urgency that sent a chill down the attorney's spine. Between gasping breaths and sobs, he managed to speak. 4 words tumbled out of his mouth, each one hitting Nicholas like a punch to the gut. They took my mom. Time seemed to freeze. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing down on Nicholas as the weight of those words sank in. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The boy stood there, trembling, clutching the edge of Nicholas's desk as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the storm brewing inside the quiet confines of this office. For a moment, Nicholas forgot how to breathe. There was something about the boy's voice, the raw honesty, the desperation, that pierced through the layers of cynicism he'd built up over the years. This wasn't some fabricated story designed to tug at heartstrings. This was real, painfully, heartbreakingly real. And just like that, what had begun as an ordinary day transformed into something entirely different. Nicholas knew, even before he fully processed what was happening, that his life was about to change forever. The room fell silent except for the sound of the boy's ragged breathing. Nicholas stared at him, his mind racing to make sense of what he'd just heard. The words, "They took my mom," echoed in his head like a haunting refrain. He wanted to ask questions, to demand clarity, but the sheer distress on the child's face stopped him. This wasn't the time for interrogation. It was the time for compassion. Nicholas pushed himself away from his desk and knelt down so that he was eye level with the boy. Kneeling felt unfamiliar. It had been years since he'd bent down to meet anyone at their level, let alone a child. Up close, he could see the streaks of dirt mixed with tears on the boy's cheeks, the way his small hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the desk. His heart clenched involuntarily. "What's your name?" Nicholas asked gently, keeping his voice calm and steady. Ethan," the boy stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, Ethan. I'm Nicholas. Can you tell me what happened?" Ethan sniffled, trying to catch his breath. His eyes darted around the room as though searching for something or someone who might come barging in after him. Finally he spoke, his words tumbling out in fragments. "Mama, they came to our house. Men in uniforms. They yelled at her, and she told me to run. She said, "Go find help." And then, his voice cracked and fresh tears spilled down his face. And then they took her. Nicholas's stomach churned. Something about this didn't sit right. Uniformed men taking someone away. It sounded more like a scene from a movie than real life. But Ethan's pain was undeniable, and Nicholas knew better than most how truth often hid behind seemingly impossible stories. "Where did they take her, Ethan? Do you know where she is now?" Ethan hesitated, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Then he reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "She gave me this before they came," he said, handing it to Nicholas. "She said if anything ever happened, I should go here." Nicholas unfolded the paper carefully. Written in shaky handwriting was an address, a location Nicholas vaguely recognized as being on the outskirts of town. It was an industrial area, full of warehouses and factories long abandoned or repurposed. What would a mother be doing giving her son such an address? And why would uniformed men show up at their home? As these questions swirled in his mind, Nicholas glanced back at Ethan. The boy looked utterly lost, his wide eyes brimming with fear and exhaustion. Whatever had happened, it had clearly terrified him. Nicholas felt a pang of guilt for having spent so many years buried in mundane legal battles when cases like this, real, urgent human ones, were happening right under his nose. He placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We'll figure this out, okay? Together. You're safe here." Ethan nodded weakly, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Nicholas couldn't blame him. Trust didn't come easily to someone who'd just seen their world turned upside down. Still, there was a flicker of hope in the boy's eyes, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, this stranger could help. Nicholas stood up and moved to grab a tissue box from the corner of his desk. Handing it to Ethan, he said softly, "Here, take your time. We'll get through this step by step." While Ethan wiped his face and tried to compose himself, Nicholas began jotting down notes. Address, uniforms, abduction. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but they hinted at something far bigger than either of them could comprehend. As much as Nicholas wanted answers, he knew rushing into things wouldn't help. He needed to tread carefully for Ethan's sake and for whoever else might be involved. But one thing was certain. Those 4 words, "They took my mom," had ignited something within him. A spark of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Whatever lay ahead, Nicholas knew he couldn't turn away now. Not when a frightened little boy was counting on him. With Ethan sitting quietly in the chair across from him, clutching a now empty tissue box, Nicholas knew he had to act quickly, but carefully. The boy's trust was fragile, and Nicholas didn't want to overwhelm him with too many questions all at once. Still, time was of the essence. Every passing minute meant Ethan's mother could be moving farther away, or worse, disappearing entirely. "Ethan," Nicholas began gently, leaning forward on his desk. "Do you remember anything else about what happened? What did the men look like? Did they say where they were taking your mom?" Ethan frowned, concentrating hard as if trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle in his mind. "They wore uniforms," he said slowly. "Dark blue with badges, but I don't think they were police officers. Mama called them bad people." His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "One of them shouted something about papers and rules. They kept saying she didn't belong here." Nicholas's heart sank. The mention of papers and rules pointed toward immigration enforcement, or something masquerading as it. He'd heard whispers about private contractors operating under questionable legal authority, targeting vulnerable individuals without proper oversight. If Ethan's mother was caught up in such a system, finding her would be no easy task. "Okay, good job, Ethan," Nicholas said, offering an encouraging smile. "You're doing great. Now, do you know why your mom gave you that address? Did she ever talk about it before today?" Ethan shook his head. "No, she just told me to keep it safe. She said it was important." Nicholas studied the crumpled paper again. The address wasn't familiar enough to jog any memories, but it was specific enough to warrant investigation. He grabbed his phone and did a quick online search. Sure enough, the location corresponded to an old warehouse complex, a sprawling industrial site that had fallen into disrepair years ago. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would willingly choose as a meeting point unless absolutely necessary. "We need to check this out," Nicholas muttered to himself. Turning back to Ethan, he added, "I'm going to see if I can find some answers. In the meantime, you stay here. This is a safe place, okay? No one will hurt you." Ethan nodded hesitantly, though his eyes betrayed his unease. To distract him, Nicholas pulled out a notepad and handed it to the boy along with a pen. "Here, draw me a picture of your house while I make some calls. Anything you think might help." As Ethan started sketching, Nicholas picked up the phone and dialed a contact he hadn't spoken to in months. Detective Laura Mendez, an old colleague from his early days in criminal law. Though their paths had diverged over the years, Laura still owed him a favor, and Nicholas wasn't above calling it in when lives were at stake. "Laura, it's Nick," he said when she answered. "Look, I need your help. Have you heard anything lately about shady operations involving uniformed personnel? Possible detentions outside official channels?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Nick, are you sticking your nose where it doesn't belong again?" Laura asked, her tone teasing but laced with concern. "Maybe," Nicholas admitted. "But this time it's personal. A kid came into my office today. His mom was taken. By men in uniforms. I've got an address, but I don't know who's running the show. Can you dig around for me?" Laura sighed. "All right, give me the details. But Nick, be careful. If this is what I think it is, you're stepping into dangerous territory." After hanging up, Nicholas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was grim. Whoever these people were, they weren't playing by the rules. And if they found out Nicholas was sniffing around, there was no telling how far they'd go to shut him down. Still, as he glanced over at Ethan, who was now coloring furiously, lost in his own little world, Nicholas felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about protecting a child who had already been through too much. For the first time in years, Nicholas Harper felt truly alive, and he wasn't about to let fear stand in his way. The next morning, Nicholas set out to investigate the address Ethan had given him. He left the boy in the care of a trusted neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Dawson, who lived 2 floors above his office. Though Ethan protested at first, clinging to Nicholas's sleeve, he eventually agreed to stay behind after Nicholas promised to return as soon as possible. The drive to the industrial zone took longer than expected. As Nicholas navigated the narrow streets lined with crumbling warehouses and rusted chain-link fences, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional caw of crows circling overhead. It wasn't the kind of place where people lingered unless they had something to hide, or nothing left to lose. When he arrived at the address scrawled on the crumpled paper, Nicholas parked his car a block away and approached on foot. The building before him was massive, its windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. A faded sign above the entrance read, "Pierce Logistics," though it was clear the business hadn't operated in years. Everything about the place screamed abandonment, but Nicholas knew better than to trust appearances. He circled the perimeter cautiously, keeping an eye out for security cameras or guards. Near the back of the property, he spotted a side door, slightly ajar, its hinges squeaking softly in the breeze. Peering inside, he saw dim light filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air smelled musty, like damp concrete and old metal. His instincts told him this was no ordinary warehouse. As he stepped inside, Nicholas noticed faint traces of recent activity. Tire tracks in the dirt, discarded food wrappers, and what looked like fresh boot prints leading deeper into the building. Following them, he came across a series of makeshift offices partitioned off with plywood. Papers were scattered across one desk, including documents written in languages he didn't recognize. Among them, however, was something chillingly familiar, a stack of forms bearing official-looking seals and signatures. They appeared to be deportation orders, though the names listed were crossed out and replaced with others in hurried handwriting. Nicholas's pulse quickened. This wasn't just some rogue operation. It was systematic. Someone was using this facility to detain individuals without due process, likely targeting undocumented immigrants or those unable to defend themselves. And if Ethan's mother was among them, she was running out of time. Before he could examine further, a noise startled him, a distant shout followed by heavy footsteps. Panicking, Nicholas ducked behind a stack of crates, clutching his phone tightly in case he needed to call for help. Two men entered the room moments later, dressed in dark uniforms similar to the ones Ethan had described. Their voices carried as they argued about logistics and schedules, mentioning locations Nicholas didn't recognize but jotting down notes furiously. "They're moving her tonight," one man said gruffly. "Orders from upstairs." "Good riddance," the other replied. "She's been nothing but trouble since we brought her in." Nickers froze. Her. Could they be talking about Ethan's mother? He strained to hear more, but the men moved toward another section of the warehouse, their conversation fading into muffled whispers. Knowing he couldn't risk staying any longer, Nicholas slipped out the way he came, heart pounding. Back in his car, he replayed everything he'd seen and heard. The pieces were falling into place, but the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. Whoever was behind this operation had resources and power. Taking them on wouldn't be easy, especially not alone. By the time he returned to the office, Ethan was waiting anxiously by the window. When he saw Nicholas pull up, relief washed over his face. "Did you find her?" he asked eagerly. "I'm close," Nicholas replied, forcing a reassuring smile despite the weight pressing down on him. "But we've got work to do. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move." That night, as Nicholas sat poring over the notes he'd taken, he realized something important. This wasn't just about saving one woman. It was about exposing a system designed to exploit the vulnerable. And if he succeeded, it might mean risking everything he had, including his own safety. But looking at Ethan asleep on the couch, curled up under a blanket, Nicholas knew there was no turning back. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive and ready to fight for something worth fighting for. The next few days blurred together for Nicholas as he worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle surrounding Ethan's mother. He spent hours combing through public records, cross-referencing names from the documents he'd found in the warehouse, with news articles about mysterious disappearances in the city. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the connections became. It wasn't just one isolated case, it was a pattern. People were vanishing without explanation, often after encounters with uniformed individuals claiming authority they didn't legally possess. But Nicholas wasn't the only one paying attention. By the fourth day, his investigation had attracted unwanted notice. As he stepped out of his office late one evening, locking the door behind him, two men emerged from the shadows of a nearby alleyway. They weren't dressed in uniforms this time, but their presence was unmistakably threatening. One was tall and broad-shouldered, while the other was wiry but no less intimidating. Both wore dark jackets that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. "Mr. Harper," the taller man said, his voice low and deliberate. "We need to have a word." Nicholas instinctively took a step back, his hand tightening around his car keys. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "No one you need to worry about," the shorter man replied, smirking. "But we hear you've been asking questions. Nosy folks tend to get hurt." "I'm just doing my job," Nicholas shot back, though his heart raced. "If someone's in trouble, it's my duty to help them." The taller man chuckled coldly. "Your duty ends here, counselor. Stop poking around where you don't belong, or things could get messy, for you and for the boy." At the mention of Ethan, Nicholas felt a surge of anger so intense it nearly overwhelmed his fear. "Leave him out of this," he growled, taking another cautious step backward. "He's done nothing wrong." "Oh, we know," the shorter man said casually. "But accidents happen, especially when people refuse to listen." Before Nicholas could respond, the two men turned and disappeared into the darkness as quickly as they'd appeared. Shaken, He hurried to his car and locked the doors before letting himself breathe again. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he drove home, replaying the encounter over and over in his mind. Whoever these men were, they meant business, and they weren't afraid to escalate. Back at his apartment, Nicholas found it impossible to sleep. Every creak of the floorboards made him jump. Every shadow outside his window seemed suspicious. But even more than fear, he felt resolve hardening within him. These threats only confirmed what he already suspected. He was onto something big, something dangerous enough to warrant silencing. And if he backed down now, not only would Ethan lose his mother forever, but countless others would remain trapped in silence. The following morning, Nicholas sat Ethan down and explained the situation carefully, omitting the details that might scare him further. "Ethan, I think your mom is being held somewhere unsafe," he said gently. "And there are people who don't want me helping her. But I promise you I won't stop until we bring her back." Ethan looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "You won't leave me alone, will you?" "Never," Nicholas assured him firmly. "We're in this together." To protect Ethan, Nicholas decided to move him temporarily to a safe house, a secluded cabin owned by an old friend who owed him a favor. The fewer people who knew their location, the better. Once Ethan was settled, Nicholas returned to the city, determined to finish what he'd started. That night he met secretly with Detective Laura Mendez, who had uncovered some troubling information. "Nick, you're playing with fire," she warned, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were photos of high-ranking officials linked to the operation, along with bank records showing large sums of money funneled into offshore accounts. "This goes higher than you realize. If you go public, they'll come after you and anyone connected to you." Nicholas stared at the evidence, his jaw tightening. "Then let them come," he said quietly. "Because I'm not backing down," Laura sighed, shaking her head. "You always were stubborn, just be careful, okay? You've got a kid counting on you." As Nicholas left the cafe where they'd met, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Danger loomed closer with each passing hour, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting for fame or fortune. He was fighting for justice. And whether it cost him everything or not, he knew it was worth it. Nicholas spent the next 2 days meticulously planning his next move. Armed. With the evidence Laura had provided, and the documents he'd gathered from the warehouse, he knew he had enough to expose the operation. But going public wasn't as simple as it seemed. If he acted too soon or without proper preparation, the people behind this scheme could disappear into the shadows, erasing any trace of their crimes. Worse still, they might retaliate against Ethan or his mother before Nicholas could ensure their safety. He decided to take a calculated risk. Using encrypted communication channels, Nicholas reached out to a trusted journalist named Clara Bennett, who specialized in investigative reporting. She was known for her tenacity and integrity, qualities Nicholas desperately needed on his side. Over a secure video call, he shared what he'd uncovered, showing her the photos, documents, and even the sketches Ethan had drawn of his home and the men who took his mother. "This is huge," Clara said after reviewing the materials, her voice tinged with both excitement and concern. "But Nick, if we publish this, you'll become a target. Are you ready for that?" "I don't have a choice," Nicholas replied firmly. "Ethan's mom is running out of time, and if I don't do something now, who will?" Clara nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "All right, I'll write the story and get it ready to go live. But we need to coordinate timing carefully. Once this hits the news, all hell will break loose." While Clara worked on the article, Nicholas focused on finding a way to rescue Ethan's mother. He couldn't wait for the story to break. It might be too late by then. Late one night, while reviewing the layout of the warehouse, he noticed something he'd missed before. A service entrance at the rear of the building labeled "Employee Access Only." It was less conspicuous than the main doors and likely less monitored. If he could sneak in undetected, he might be able to locate her. But just as he finalized his plan, disaster struck. Early the next morning, as Nicholas returned to the safe house to check on Ethan, he found the front door wide open. Panic surged through him as he rushed inside, calling the boy's name. The living room was empty, the blankets on the couch, tossed aside. A single sheet of paper lay on the coffee table, weighted down by a rock placed there deliberately. With trembling hands, Nicholas picked it up. The note was short and chilling. "Stop digging, or the boy won't make it out alive." For a moment, Nicholas stood frozen, the weight of the threat crushing him. They'd taken Ethan, his only leverage, the innocent child who had placed his trust in Nicholas. Guilt gnawed at him. Had he been reckless? Should he have moved Ethan sooner, hidden him better? Then anger took over. These people thought they could manipulate him, use an innocent child to silence him. But they underestimated one thing: Nicholas's determination. He wouldn't let them win. Not now, not ever. Grabbing his phone, he called Clara. "Change of plans," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Publish the story tonight. Leak everything you have to every major outlet. Make sure it's impossible for them to cover it up." "What about Ethan?" Clara asked, her tone sharp with worry. "I'll find him," Nicholas vowed, "but I can't save him if I'm dead, or if they bury the truth first." As the evening approached, Nicholas prepared for the most dangerous mission of his life. He packed a small bag with essentials, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a burner phone, and memorized the warehouse layout once more. Before leaving, he sent a quick message to Clara. "If anything happens to me, protect Ethan, promise me." Her reply came instantly. "You'd better come back alive, Nick. We're counting on you." Driving toward the industrial zone under the cover of darkness, Nicholas felt a strange calm settle over him. Fear still lingered at the edges, but it no longer controlled him. He was fighting for something greater than himself, for justice, for Ethan, and for everyone trapped in the shadows. As he parked far from the warehouse and began making his way toward the service entrance, he whispered a silent prayer. This was it. Whatever happened next would change everything. The night air was thick with tension as Nicholas crept toward the warehouse, his every step deliberate and silent. The distant hum of machinery and the occasional screech of a stray cat were the only sounds breaking the eerie stillness. He clutched, the flashlight tightly in one hand, its beam turned off for now while his other hand gripped the pocket knife like a lifeline. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every noise amplified tenfold in the darkness. His heart pounded so loudly he feared it might give him away. Reaching the service entrance, Nicholas paused, listening intently. The door was slightly ajar, just as he'd hoped, though the faint creak of rusted hinges made him wince as he pushed it open further. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit by sporadic emergency lights mounted high on the walls, casting long, flickering shadows across stacks of crates and abandoned equipment. The air smelled stale, laced with the metallic tang of old machinery. Nicholas moved cautiously, sticking close to the walls to avoid being seen. As he ventured deeper, he began hearing voices, low murmurs that grew clearer the farther he went. Following the sound, he reached a corridor lined with doors, each marked with numbers painted in faded black. Behind one of them, he heard Ethan's muffled cries. Relief surged through him, quickly followed by anger. They had taken a child, an innocent boy, and locked him away like an animal. Nicholas scanned the area, searching for guards or cameras. To his relief, the hallway appeared deserted. He tried the first door. It was locked. The second yielded, the same result. On the third attempt, however, the handle turned quietly and he slipped inside. The room was small and windowless, illuminated only by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the corner, huddled on the floor, was Ethan. His face was streaked with tears, but when he saw Nicholas, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Nick," Ethan whispered hoarsely, scrambling to his feet. "You came." "I told you I wouldn't. Leave you alone," Nicholas said softly, pulling the boy into a tight embrace. "We're getting out of here." Ethan nodded, clinging to Nicholas as if afraid he might disappear. But there was no time for comfort. They needed to move fast. Nicholas glanced around the room, spotting a set of keys hanging on a hook near the door. Grabbing them, he unlocked Ethan's handcuffs, which had left red marks around his tiny wrists. "Stay close to me," Nicholas instructed, keeping his voice low. "And if anything happens, run. Don't look back, okay?" Ethan nodded. Again, his expression a mix of fear and determination. Together, they stepped back into the hallway, moving swiftly but silently. Just as they rounded a corner, footsteps echoed ahead. A guard appeared, flashlight in hand, scanning the area suspiciously. Nicholas froze, shoving Ethan behind him. For a split second, neither man nor intruder moved. Then, acting purely on instinct, Nicholas lunged forward, tackling the guard before he could react. The flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam bouncing wildly across the walls. A brief struggle ensued, but Nicholas managed to pin the man down long enough to grab his weapon, a stun baton, and knock him unconscious. "Let's go," Nicholas urged, grabbing Ethan's hand and sprinting toward the exit. Alarms blared suddenly, piercing the silence like a knife. Red lights flashed overhead as shouts erupted throughout the building. "They know we're here," Nicholas shouted, over the noise. "Run!" They dashed through the maze of corridors, dodging obstacles and narrowly avoiding collisions with rushing guards. At one point, Ethan stumbled, scraping his knee, but Nicholas hauled him up without hesitation, urging him onward. Finally, they burst through a side door, emerging into the cool night air. Behind them, the warehouse buzzed with activity, but Nicholas didn't stop. Not until they reached his car, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, did he allow himself a moment to breathe. "You're safe now," he told Ethan, his voice shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. "We made it." By the time Nicholas and Ethan reached the safe house, the city was already waking up to chaos. Clara's article had gone live late that night, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms and news outlets. Headlines screamed about corruption, illegal detentions, and abuse of power. The evidence Nicholas had gathered, photos, documents, and testimonies, was undeniable. Within hours, protests erupted outside government buildings, demanding accountability. Prominent figures named in the expose issued frantic denials, but the public wasn't buying it anymore. Nicholas watched the unfolding drama on his laptop, his hands trembling not from fear this time, but from exhaustion. Ethan sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket, clutching a cup of hot chocolate. Though still shaken, there was a glimmer of hope in the boy's eyes as he listened to Nicholas explain what was happening. "Your mom is going to be okay," Nicholas assured him. "People are fighting for her now." It didn't take long for authorities to act. Under mounting pressure, federal agents raided the warehouse and several other locations linked to the operation. Dozens of detainees were freed, including Ethan's mother, Maria. When she arrived at the safe house later that day, escorted by protective services, the reunion was nothing short of miraculous. Ethan ran into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably as she held him close, whispering words of love and gratitude. Nicholas stepped back, giving them space, though Maria insisted on pulling him into a tight embrace too. "You saved us," she said, tears streaming down her face. "How can we ever thank you?" Nicholas shook his head, humbled. "Just promise me you'll stay safe. That's all I need." In the weeks that followed, the scandal dominated headlines nationwide. Investigations uncovered layers of corruption reaching far beyond what anyone had imagined. High-ranking officials resigned or faced criminal charges, while advocacy groups used the momentum to push for systemic reforms. Nicholas became an unlikely hero, hailed for his bravery in exposing the truth. But fame wasn't what drove him. It was the knowledge that he'd made a difference, however small, in a world that often felt indifferent to suffering. For Ethan and Maria, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least something resembling it. With legal assistance arranged by Nicholas, they secured temporary residency status, allowing them to rebuild their lives without fear of deportation. Ethan started attending school again, his laughter returning bit by bit. Maria found work at a local bakery, grateful for the chance to provide for her son. As for Nicholas, the experience changed him profoundly. He closed his corporate law practice and founded a nonprofit dedicated to helping vulnerable individuals caught in unjust systems. His office transformed into a hub of activity, filled with volunteers eager to make a difference. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, driven by purpose rather than profit. One evening, as he packed up to leave the office, Ethan appeared in the doorway, surprising him. Now smiling more often, the boy carried a drawing he'd made, a colorful picture of Nicholas standing tall beside a shining sun. "This is you," Ethan said proudly, handing it over. "You're the reason everything got better." Nicholas accepted the drawing, touched by its simplicity and sincerity. As he looked at it, he realized something important. Heroes weren't defined by grand gestures or superhuman strength. They were ordinary people who chose to stand up when others stayed silent. And sometimes, all it took was 4 devastating words spoken by a frightened child to remind someone why they mattered. With a smile, Nicholas pinned the drawing to the wall behind his desk, a reminder of where he'd been and how far he'd come.